All right. Now, let's start talking about brisket. So this right here is a packer brisket, which just means it has the lean end and the moist end all together. All right, so it has both parts. So again, the lean and the moist end. The lean end on this side right here, you know, we call this the flat. The moist end, we call it the point. So certain things that I want to do is, as we kind of go through this process, I'm gonna be using a lot of words and stuff like that in terms of like what this is, what that is. I'm cutting off this, so just to kind of give you guys terminology of everything, of what I'm using. When you flip it on the bottom, you have this chunk of fat right here. This is what I call, and like you'll hear a lot of people call the heel fat right here. That's also part of this, like the decal fat. The decal fat is that fat band that kind of runs all the way through the brisket. So this is part of the decal. It's coming all the way through here, okay? The other part that I'm gonna be mentioning a lot about is kind of use these interchangeably. Some people call it the mohawk, some people call it the hump, and that's this chunk of meat right here. You'll usually see on top of the moist end of the brisket where there is some exposed meat, and that's kind of like that mohawk, that hump part that we're talking about. And so during those steps when we're trying to trim this brisket up, I'm gonna be referring to this as the hump or the mohawk. All right, also one last thing is I really like the fat coverage on top right here as well. There's no scalps, there's no like deep cuts and stuff like that. So we want to preserve that as much as possible. All right, so what I want to do during this video is to give you guys 5 steps that I use in order to trim briskets, and the same kind of steps that I use to explain to other people that I'm training how to train brisket, what I'm looking for, what I want them to do. So step 1 is going to be to cut out the heel fat and clean the bottom of the brisket. 2 is going to be to cut down the mohawk and the hump. 3 is going to be shaping the edges. Step 4 is going to be shaving down that top fat, the even fat on top that we're talking about. And then step 5, I mean, it's not really a step, it's kind of like repeating step 3 and 4. So as we continuously trim this down, we want to make sure that that shape and that fat and everything is where we want it to be. So I'm gonna keep emphasizing these steps as we do it, but yeah, let's get started. All right, so to start, I'm gonna use my my curved boning knife, and to open up the vacuum seal bag, we want to, again, like you said, nothing is scalped, nothing is cut out. So I want to make sure that I'm not making any big gashes when I'm just trying to open this thing up. So one of the things that I'm going to do is, because the first step is to cut out this heel fat anyway, I'm just going to score this heel fat. Right now, I can get a deeper cut without necessarily worrying about without digging into any of the meat. So just make sure you guys are careful and you're not trying to, I'm doing this at home right now. I don't want any blood to be splatting all over the place. So just try to take it up carefully. Hold all that blood inside the bag, and we're going to toss out the entire thing all together. All right, so now that it's out of the bag, you can kind of see how it's loosened up a little bit. Now with this heel fat right here, some people like to dig it out. And some people just kind of like to smooth it out. I am the smooth it out type of person. You can dig it out and still get a very good product, but the only thing is, especially if you're starting out cooking with briskets, if you dig a hole in there a little bit too deep and you have a little bit of problem controlling your temps and it gets a little bit too hot and it creates just a pocket inside there where there's heat, you might risk drying out that little middle part right there. So just to be safe, and I like to, later on, I let people do whatever they want, but at least just to start, we're just going to shave this down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of take this at an angle, and right here, I'm going to take my knife and put it right here so I can take this entire chunk off. I'm not going to spend time shaving this down, multiple steps. It's going to seem like a lot, but I'm going to take out an entire chunk. So once I find that, I'm going to put my knife at an angle like this, and just run it across, just take this whole thing out. Again, this is gonna go in my trim bucket. All right, now, the one thing I like about this right here now is that it's super smooth, that it's not really catching any air. There's not gonna be an issue with me you know, cooking anything over here, because again, all that was just mostly just fat. So it would just sit there, wouldn't render, it wouldn't do anything. Now the next thing, like we said, is we're going to try to clean up the bottom as much as possible. So I would say, you know, it does take a little bit of practice to kind of get a lot of it off, but the biggest trick I would say is to shave with the grain of the muscle. If you try to go against the grain, you're going to create a lot of divots in there, and that's the one thing we don't want. So the grain is going this way right here, so I'm going to make sure my knife is going that way as well the entire time. So this fat right here, it is still a little bit thick, so I'm going to take off this, I'm going to take off this, take off some of this feathery fat. Later on, I'm going to trim this off later anyway, so I'm not necessarily too worried about that because I'm going to cut that off, but we'll get to that later. So I'm going to show you, again, going across the grain. You might take off a little meat, it's all right, don't worry about it. Okay, and we're just taking, like, I'm not worried about taking these, like, you know, I'm not worried about taking these like little feathery pieces off. I wanna make it smooth. So, you know, it might look like I'm compared to other people, I'm taking a lot more fat off the bottom because obviously there is a little bit of meat that's coming off, but to me, I prefer that just because it's really nice and smooth now. Like, you're almost creating a new surface of that brisket without having that excess you know, that membrane on top right there. Okay, so you can tell from before, you know, it's a lot cleaner. You can kind of see more of the meat. You can definitely see more of the grain. This fat right here, there's still some left, but it is a little bit deeper inside there. So I don't want to go inside and dig it out, because then, like we said, we're going to create that little divot or that crevice inside there that I don't want to take out. Okay, so for now, to me, this is perfect. This bottom right here is nice and clean. There's not, again, like this portion right here, I'm gonna cut off a little bit later anyway. So I'm just gonna leave that for now. All right. So that's step one. Step one was, you know, is to cut out the heel fat and clean up the bottom. So now we're gonna flip it over. Now we're gonna work on step two, which is cutting down that mohawk or that hump. So again, similarly to that heel fat, we're gonna try to cut out some of this decal fat from here, but we got to be very, very careful with this. All right, so when I'm cutting it down, I don't want to keep my knife super, so if I'm holding it like that, I don't want my knife to be flat like that, because then I'm going to take off this entire portion, which would be a mistake. I just want to take off enough to where, and again, it's still going to seem like I'm taking out a lot, but I just want to have a clear line of where I'm doing. So I'm going to start off from here, and I want my cut to finish around here, so kind of where that lean end and that moist end kind of meet, which is roughly around this line right here. Okay, so we're going to take this knife at an angle, and we're just going to shave it down, and again, I'm finishing off my cut all the way down there. Okay, now this is some good meat down here. I mean, the marbling looks great, but I mean, look at how much fat there is. That's if we don't cut that off, you can see probably about 50% of that is fat right there. So later on, like if I were to go to a restaurant and someone gave me a slice of, and I asked for moist brisket, and they gave me that slice from all the way in this end right here, man, I'd be pissed, because they're basically serving me, you know, half a pound of fat with that. Again, we're still going to use all this. It's still good fat, still very good meat over here, so we're still going to save it. All right. Okay. Now, so we took down that hump, we took down that mohawk. So step three is going to be shaping around the edges. So if you look over here now, this right here, because I took off that moist end, all we got left is fat, a little thick layer of fat, and this lean brisket right here. And you can tell this brisket, this lean end right here, there's not much marbling. So to me, you know, it's not that it's bad. It'll make good chopped brisket, but for me, I'd prefer to cut this off, give my brisket a better shape, and just to make sure that it's, you know, I mean, I personally still wouldn't want that slice even after I cut that down, because it's not very good. So, and you can also tell right here on the edges right here, after I took down that mohawk, we got these little things that are sticking out. Okay, so while we're trimming briskets, we want to shave down and make everything look super clean and crisp as much as possible. So as we shave down this end, I'm gonna start off here, and as I work my knife, I'm gonna kind of turn it so that I can kind of create a little curve on this side, because we don't want anything that's sticking out like that. All right, so I'm gonna start off right here, and again, kind of turning my knife a little bit so it's scooping and then scooping underneath that way. Still good meat. Again, saving that as well. All right. Now, we talked about earlier before how this lean end right here is super, super thin. And so we're gonna, again, it's gonna seem like a lot. I'm gonna say this a lot. I'm taking off a lot off this brisket. But we talked about before, the reason why I'm gonna cut this off is it's just fat and really lean brisket. This brisket right here, this portion is too thin. So if I leave it on, it's just gonna burn. It's just not gonna be very good. So we're just gonna take it off altogether. So with that being said, I'm kind of creating a line of, this is what I like to do a lot of too. If I'm really unsure of how I really wanna cut it, I'll just kind of use my knife and use the tip of the knife and kind of score it a little bit to kind of create an imaginary line of where I want to go so I can kind of follow it. And you can kind of see the shape of this brisket now that I'm trying to look for. I'm just taking off all this excess that is just either going to be too lean or it's going to be dry. So I'm going to take that line right there, and we're just going to go and take this entire thing off, okay? All right. So again, it's still very good meat. It's just not going to be good as a whole on a brisket. So that's going to be tossed out right there. All right, now if we look at this edge right here, and this is kind of like what Franklin does as well. Like, he'll cut off the edges so you can see how much fat he's got. And to me, right there, that's kind of the perfect thickness of that fat from this side to this side. Now, because I've made all these like really super clean cuts, you can tell right here on this fat, it's kind of come to a point. And I don't really want that. So the one thing I'm going to do is just one last cut is I'm going to take my knife and just run it across this little corner because I don't want it to catch air. I want it to be really smooth. So I'm just going to, the other thing that I'm doing is I'm pushing my knife for these kind of cuts against the cutting board, and I'm just dragging it just so that I can get a nice even cut, and that I'm not like scalping anything. I'm not having super uneven cuts anywhere. And like, you know, this part was a little bit thicker on this fat, so if I just kind of tug it, now I can take that off as well. So, you know, we're just, every once in a while, we're just double checking these briskets. I'm pulling on the edges to see if I've missed anything underneath, but it looks pretty clean, okay? And this part right here, again, I'm super picky, so this part's a little sticking out just a tad. I'll take that off, and we get to go, all right? Sweet. Now, we're gonna work on this side. So now we took off the hump. Now you kind of shape that side. Step 4 is gonna be shaving down that top fat. So this top fat right here. Now this is the part I think most people kind of get nervous about because they don't want to scalp the brisket. But look, I'm gonna let you know this. Look, at any restaurant that you go to, if we get, let's say if we get 100 briskets, there, I would say probably at least, you know, 15 to 20 of them are already coming scalped. So you scalping a brisket is not gonna ruin the cook. I mean, obviously if you take down a giant chunk, then yeah, that's something different. But you know, while you're scalping it, and you know what, and I'm saying this too because I haven't trimmed a brisket in a while, so if I happen to scalp it anyway, I'm not gonna freak out about it. You know, we cook scalp briskets all the time. We just wanna make sure we get it even as much as possible. That I would rather have slightly scalped briskets with the right amount of fat than being scared of scalping and leaving too much fat where you know, it just doesn't taste right. So for starting from this end, I like to start off on this end right here in that moist end. This is kind of typically where there seems to be a lot of fat. So I'm just gonna take your time with this. You know, we're not you know, I don't want to completely gash this brisket, but I also want to make sure that, you know, we just don't want to have so much excess fat that it just becomes very unpleasant. You know, I'd rather have brisket that's cooked really well and have a little bit less fat than having too much fat, because the meat itself is already so rich, especially on that moist end. And we'll fast forward this part just so you guys don't have to watch me trim this entire brisket. Just real quick, something like I said earlier when I was taking off this side, when I'm taking off
this edge right here, I like to put my knife against the cutting board and just kind of drag my knife there.
The one thing that we don't want to do is as we're trimming it, we don't want to like trim a little bit off and then trim another section off, because then we'll create these grooves in there. And then if we have too many divots like that, when we cook the brisket, what's going to happen is that fat and all that water that's coming out of the brisket during the cooking process will pool up into those little areas, and you'll have bald spots because the pepper and the salt that you put on the brisket, even if you put a binder on there like an oil or a mustard, it's still gonna pool and wash off all your rub. So again, on this side right here, again, I'm a lefty, so if you have a different type of brisket, you know, you can't do this one, but from here, I'm putting the tip of my knife on the cutting board. If I'm feeling on top of this brisket, and you know, as you get closer and closer down to that fat, like it'll start to feel a little bit more pillowy and a little bit softer instead of more firm. So at this point, after I think I'm finished, I'm just kind of poking all over the brisket just to make sure that fat feels very similar all the way across. So this lean end feels pretty good. This part right here feels slightly thicker, so I'm gonna take down a little bit off here. Take a little bit off there as well. And then that's it in terms of shaving it. But now that I'm looking at this brisket, and something that I want to do is I kind of want to round out these corners on this lean end right here, because even though this side right here is very straight and it might come out to have some really good slices, I honestly prefer it to be a little bit rounded just to help protect the corners of these briskets, and this really has to do, you know, you'll hear a lot of people talk about, you know, the way that you trim, the way that you do this and this or that really depends on your smoker that you're cooking on. And I haven't cooked on my smoker in my backyard in probably over a year or so. But the one thing I do know is it tends to cook a little bit hotter, and which is the reason why I want to make sure I protect these corners right here. And just to do that, I'm going to shave these corners down just so that there's nothing sticking out. So if you feel a little bit uncomfortable, I would say just push out with your hand like that to see how much it stretches out, and start from here and just kind of cut off corners at a time like that. And as you kind of take off more and more, it'll start to take that shape that you want it to. Okay, so if you're not comfortable with taking one big swoop like that, definitely take your time. Doesn't really matter how much or how small these pieces are, because you know what, later on if you grind this stuff anyway, I mean, this is kind of shape that you want. That's it. To me, from the shape of the brisket that we started with, to me, this is a more ideal shape. This is a more ideal look on this brisket. It's nice and smooth. There might be some things that I'm going to cut off like this right here, but ultimately, we don't have any jagged edges. Everything's nice and smooth. The thickness of that fat it's great. You know, we have a little fat right there that's going to render down nicely. I didn't scalp any fat over here, but the fat, I know it's slightly thin. Like you can kind of see it shining through a little bit, which is, to me, I kind of like that, just so I know that I got close enough without scalping it, meaning so later on when I go to slice this brisket, when it's done, I'll have enough fat. It's not going to be overly fatty. I'll have enough to kind of cover it and protect it during the cook. Shape on it's really good. If I flip over to the bottom, again, remember we had a bunch of the excess stuff on here, but we ended up cutting it all off anyway. So to me, boom, That's it. That's a perfectly trimmed brisket to me. We'll season this up, and then we'll put it on the smoker early tomorrow morning. That's it, guys. Is it weird that I'm petting this brisket like this?